Oh, hello, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today it's sort of a sad episode because it's a sad story. And this is the life and death of Greg Ham. Now, Greg Ham was a wonderful musician who played every variety of keyboard, saxophone, flute, and other things in Australia's Men at Work, one of the bands that had a defining sound of the 80s, somewhat unexpected, but they had so many hits: Land Down Under, Who Could It Be Now, Be Good Johnny, it's a Mistake, one of my favorites, and so many others. And in many ways, it was Greg's playing on sax and on flute that really gave the band a very distinctive identity. Pardon me. Now, Greg was someone who had a great musical career, and everything at Men at Work was rolling along fine until the early 2000s, when there was a copyright lawsuit against Men at Work involving a riff that was played on the flute by Greg in the song A Land Down Under. Now, Greg died in 2012, just about 10 years after the original lawsuit came down the pipeline. He became somewhat addicted to drugs following the lawsuit. And I would say that Greg Ham is one of the, certainly not the only, but a casualty of unfair and systemically evil copyright laws. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not like Jack Dorsey, who thinks we shouldn't have intellectual property. Otherwise, how would creative and inventive people make a living? And so, obviously, if you write a song, that you should own the song. If you record the song, you should own the recording. A lot of the time, the record label does, but you get my drift. The creator of something ought to own the IP, whether it's a patent, whether it's a copyright, whether it's a trademark or wordmark, whatever. The list goes on. Now, where copyright law becomes evil is during plagiarism lawsuits, particularly in the arts. With things like patents and others, it can still be very evil, but at least then there's sort of somewhat of a scientific and inventive trail to follow. Creativity, though, is an intuitive process. It's about absorbing influences, it's about absorbing emotions, it's about the fact there's only so many notes and only so many possible chord combinations unless we go into the avenues of dissonance. And so, inevitably, songs are going to sometimes sound kind of like other songs. I don't think this should be a tortious offense. In other words, I don't think you should be able to sue people because your song sounds like my song. Now, obviously, if you're doing a straight ripoff, that's one thing. And there is a legal test that should be applied to this. And this is the test called actual malice. You need to sit down and say, this song sounds interesting. Don't mind if I take a bit of that. And obviously with sampling, it's obvious you're sampling a well-known piece of work. I think that the fees charged for artists to sample should be much lower. I think that a profit share should be something considered for young artists because let's say you're a young hip hop producer, you want to sample something. You're probably not going to make any money on your first track, but they would still expect you to pay loads of money to sample it. Where I think it should be anyone can use it. You credit the people and you say, look, if this makes any money, any real money of over a certain threshold, you can have a percentage. I think that's fair. If you're a huge artist and you know it's going to sell short, you can work out an agreement ahead of time. But back to this idea of actual compositional plagiarism. Um, I think that this case was particularly egregious. So in Land Down Under, there's the flute part, played by Greg, and the copyright holder, not the artist who composed the song, but a company called Larrikin Records, they owned the copyright to a 1930s children's song called Kookaburra, which Kookaburra sits in the old gum tree, and it was written by a woman who did a lot of work for charity. She was a Christian woman. She even said herself, she said, I don't want to make any money from this song. I consider it a gift to the children of Australia and the world because it became popular elsewhere as well. But because of her death, it fell into the hands of this company that in 2002 decided to sue after on a game show, a contestant noticed that in his view, the flute riff in Land Down Under sounded somewhat like Kookaburra. And the courts demanded back payment and all sorts of other really unfair things of Men at Work, where they would have to go all the way back decades to pay not the composer but this holding company essentially money for so-called copying the song. Now, Greg maintains that any similarities were totally innocent. Like I said, the musical process is about the absorption of influences from all sorts of places, and the fact that it led to depression and drug use and his ultimate death at too young an age, I think should be a sign that copyright law internationally, do it in America, Australia, everywhere. I think it should be absolutely amended so that only if you maliciously copy someone's song can you be found guilty. And there's easier ways to find that out. If something is exactly the same, if someone, has a history of doing these things, but if you're just absorbing influences unconsciously, that is art. And these copyright laws effectively make art unlawful, and I don't like it. Let me know what you think. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.